Hamatak Yapi, good morning. We are joined this morning on the Red Nation podcast with a special guest, Nina Farnia. Nina, thanks for joining us this morning. Would you do us the pleasure of introducing yourself to our audience, our listeners, and our viewers?
Thank you so much for having me, Nick, and big thanks and shout out to Sina as well, who's a dear friend. My name is Nina Farnia. I'm an assistant professor of law at Albany Law School. I'm also a legal historian, and my research is focused on the role of U.S. imperialism um, in legal history in the world today, and specifically in the United States today.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we invited you on the podcast because you wrote a piece that is not yet published, but nonetheless is very good, and sort of lays out a kind of framework of law and fascism and sort of the dialectical relationship of those two processes or things in a liberal democracy. And I really don't like I've been listening to the news and reading the news in the last couple of days, and it's Trump's 100 days, right? And it's this really arbitrary metric of what the administration is supposed to have accomplished within those first 100 days. And just to kind of give a brief rundown of what has happened, and if in the last 100 days of Trump's administration, he's had I think around 140 executive orders, really sort of a blitz of, far surpassing any previous administration in terms of the amount of executive orders, even his own administration. This, in many ways could be just seen as a sort of concession by Congress in terms of, legislative authority and power. We haven't had a single major piece of legislation that's gone through Congress since Trump has been in power. And instead, we've seen sort of a tightening and a building up of the sort of police state in the United States. Whether we can kind of get into the details about whether this is resulted in increased deportations. It sure has had the effect, the psychological effect of increasing sort of terror against racialized and minority populations, especially migrants and those who support Palestinian liberation. But in terms of numbers, Trump's deportations do not even come close to Biden's deportations in terms of monthly averages. The sort of people who are coming into the United States from the U.S.-Mexico border has decreased, but it shows you that even with this kind of rhetoric of beefing up the border, being tough on immigrants, the sort of numbers don't really match, and it's more about, I would say, a sort of psychological effect, a projection of power that they are doing these things. Not to sort of take away from any of the seriousness, and we're going to get into that because there are sort of serious consequences to the things that are taking shape right now. On top of that, you've had an attack on sort of educational institutions, specifically rolling back the so-called DEI initiatives and policies at public universities. You've seen this sort of institutional wind change, so to speak, that's happened in higher education. You've had universities sort of capitulating with the Trump administration. Some would call it a capitulation. I would just say many of these universities, especially the Ivy Leagues and sort of the more prominent public universities, have wanted to always do this crackdown on Palestine solidarity movements. They didn't need Trump to do this. And in fact, many of these sort of processes were in place under the Biden administration. Just speaking from my own experience at the University of Minnesota, we were under investigation by the Department of Education. That happened under Biden's administration. It was Biden's administration that led the militarized crackdown on students and the encampments. I think that's important to point out. Trump is merely sort of finishing the job, so to speak. I think walking hand in hand with a lot of these universities. A lot of these universities now have the cover of Trump to do what they've always wanted to do. I think that's something that that needs to be sort of addressed that way. We've seen this so-called attack on the judiciary and this alleged constitutional crisis. We've had judges, repeatedly tell the Trump administration that he cannot do X, Y, and Z. I think the most prime example of that is Diego Garcia, the deportation of an El Salvadoran migrant back to El Salvador with the admission that they did it by quote unquote mistake and it was an administrative error. Trump has claimed that he cannot facilitate, his lawyers have claimed that he cannot facilitate the return of Diego Garcia, even though he was interviewed by ABC, I think it was like last night or the night before, basically saying that he could pick up the phone on his desk in the Oval Office and return him back to the United States. And so it just, it's kind of pointless to say that he's a liar, but it just shows you the sort of the arrogance of this administration and the sort of projection of power that they want to put out there, that it's not about the rule of law, because if it was about the rule of law, he would be following the rule of law. He'd be following these sort of bourgeois laws that exist. And in some ways, he's going beyond them. And I think that's the kind of topic of our conversation. And before I go on any further, because I do want to say something about his sort of imperialist agenda, but do you have any sort of additions to that sort of scorecard, Nina? And how would you rate Trump's first 100 days in office?
How would I rate?
Is it cool or is it whack? No,
1 out of 10, 2 out of 10. I mean, I think that. Are you serious? you actually?
I am not serious. I'm not serious at all. I just listen to all these podcasts and that's what they do. They're like, let's give Trump a scorecard. And it's like, this is completely like asinine. But can you reflect on these like first 100 days and maybe some of the things that I've just talked about, especially in the legal realm? What are the sort of broader meanings and impacts?
Yeah. So I think, you started with the sort of blitz of executive orders and the aggression with which everything shifted quite quickly. And I think that's a good place to start. That was obviously a strategy to show that he and his administration came in prepared. They came in with a plan, and their plan is to sort of, they've basically begun to dismantle whatever remnants of the welfare state there was, right? They've dismantled a lot of the administrative state, which is what sort of held the welfare state. I mean, I hesitate to call it a welfare state because it's hardly that, but whatever of it there is, they've largely dismantled it, and they've expanded sort of the repressive state apparatus, right? DHS has opened up task forces around the country. These might be similar to what the FBI task forces, the joint terrorism task forces that were created in the aftermath of, in the 2000s and 2010s. But it's different because it's targeting, in terms of the techniques of the state, it's targeting a whole different set of groups. They have the power to move very quickly, to move surreptitiously. They're plainclothes. They're operating without warrants. And so there are some differences in that sense. Also, though, and one of the things that's not discussed as much, we talk a lot about sort of the techniques of fascism or the techniques of the repressive state apparatus, right, which have basically always been around. They ebb and flow at any given moment, but they've always been a part of this continental empire, this location of the continental empire, and also the rest of it around the world. But the political economy of the current situation, I think, is really what's interesting, and the intersections of the political economy and the law. And what I start with in the article is this idea of the billionaire in chief. Forbes issued its annual billionaire issue on April 1st. And, Forbes is no bastion of radicalism or even progressivism or liberalism, right? Like we just to be clear, but there's the issue right there. Billionaires, there are more billionaires than ever before in world history, and they are richer than ever. There are, at the top of the list is what Forbes called the $100 billion club, centibillionaires. There are 15 at the top. 13 of those 15 are from the United States. And they hold more wealth than the bottom 1,500 billionaires combined. Okay, so we're no longer talking about the 1% versus the 99%. Forbes is actually talking about the very top tier of billionaires versus the bottom tier of the billionaires. It's a whole different scale of accumulation and exploitation. And then what Forbes says, again, no bastion of radicalism or even liberalism, what Forbes says is that Trump is the billionaire in chief because he and his administration have given more power to the billionaire class than any other administration in US history. And so now if you look at, I'm no political economist. I mean, I'm a legal historian, but I have to look at this stuff to understand what's happening in the law. And so I'm trying to understand it. If you look at these 15 individuals or 13 individuals at the very top, they're finance capitalists. They are finance capitalists. And what Georgy Dimitrov, who I talk about in the article, I theorize, or I apply the theories of Georgy Dimitrov and Gerald Horne and Anthony Ballas to the current moment that we are in. What Georgy Dimitrov said was that, he was a Bulgarian communist, that fascism is the seizure of the state by the most reactionary, most imperialist, most vile elements of finance capital, right? And the reason I go to this analysis, I appreciate this particular analysis because I'm a Marxist or Marxist-Leninist like Dr. Horne and Dimitrov, but also because this definition appreciates history and change over time, what we historians call change over time. It's sensitive to change over time in political economy, and it's sensitive to change over time in the state apparatus and in the law. And even Lenin said this in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. He said that we can't just focus on economic questions. We also have to look at the particular stage of imperialism that we're looking at, in the particular moment of imperialism that we're looking at in the context of the historical expansion of capitalism. And we have to be sensitive to this new moment. There is a new moment. If you look at the law, it's a new moment with many previous iterations, right? But it's a new moment. If you look at political economy, it's a new moment. And if you look at the fall of US imperialism, that's certainly new. Or the rise of China, that is certainly new. So in the article, I try to be sensitive to change over time in these various fields of scholarly and political analysis.
Yeah, and I think the important thing here is to understand, even when Lenin was talking about these questions, and even when I think it's Gerald Horne and Anthony Ballas in their article in Peaceland and Bread, what American fascism has already looked like, a response to the New Republic. They're talking about the kind of historical conditions of what makes white supremacy in the United States, something that has a term that has been largely derided, I think, and not properly understood in some contexts. So I think on one hand, I think the sort of DEIification of white supremacy is one in which you can hold an anti-racist training and somehow, you can root out the institution, can root out these sort of improper beliefs and make a sort of better sort of liberal democratic, workforce or liberal democratic institution or democracy. And that really ignores the kind of foundations of these institutions in the first place, and the kind of role of capitalism in fueling these racial divisions. The other sort of aspect of that is to say that white supremacy is not, it's not, that's a race centric sort of view of how how the United States works, and it ignores things like class, right? And I think there's this kind of reduction of it. And what I appreciate about Gerald Horne's work and Anthony Ballas in this article is that it really opens up the question of how the United States got to this point through forms of racial terror, which should be properly placed as forms of class oppression, right? Whether it's through the institutions of slavery and the legacies of that, or whether it's through the settler colonial nature of indigenous land dispossession and indigenous genocide. That gives us a much more robust a picture in terms of why the United States is the number one, imperialist power in the country, right, or in the world right now. It also helps us understand is sort of like how these when we talk about the sort of racial divisions of the globe, it's not just because it's not this sort of this reductive view that we do not like the Chinese because they speak a different language. We do not like the Chinese because they have a different culture. It's a political economy of a geopolitics that sort of play into that, and I think that's also the moment that we're in with Zionism, right? Because Zionism is what unites these two sort of classes of people who identify as Democrats and Republicans in this sort of reactionary ideology, where it doesn't matter if the United States is in the death throes, as a declining empire. Oh, I think we just lost Nina. Okay. There we go. Sorry. But I was just saying, Nina, that like Zionism is what unites sort of Democrats and Republicans. It's a bipartisan sort of project. And I think when we talk about how imperialism works today, you cite some pretty significant figures. There was one on the aerospace and defense, the 5-year return in the industry, companies that manufacture aerospace and defense products, including aircraft parts, tanks, guided missiles, space vehicles, ships and marine equipment, and other aerospace and defense components and the systems, as well as companies supporting these products through repair and maintenance services. So we want to bring that up on the screen so we can see this 5-year return. It's at the bottom right hand corner. I can zoom in on it. Can you talk about the significance of that particular number in this particular I'm not an economist. I can kind of understand what this means, but maybe you can break it down for us and why this 5-year return is so significant, and especially when looking at this broader graph.
So, first of all, I'm so sorry about these sounds that are coming out of my computer. I don't know how to turn them off. I'm very sorry. So again, I'm no political economist, but if the sort of common sort of thinking around investments is that an annual 10% rate of return is average. A little bit above that is good. If you look at the aerospace, the primary manufacturer, the weapons manufacturers, right, which are the primary subject of the BDS campaign being waged at universities across the country, the rate of return is extraordinary. I mean, that 127% that you just is unbelievable. And that's a 5-year rate of return. It's important to look at the 5-year context, because over the last couple of months, the trade war and the tariffs have caused some fluctuations. If you slice this timeline and leave out this last month or two, the rate of return during the Biden administration was unbelievable. So you can see directly how supplying the war in Ukraine and supplying the war in Palestine, supplying Israel and supplying Ukraine, has led to the deepening of the pockets of the wealthiest people in the United States, the billionaire class, but also a lot of other people, including many of the universities that are the subject of BDS campaigns. So what I talk about a little bit in the article, but what I theorize in my book, which that I'm finishing up now on U.S. imperialism, is that the war economy has been central, has undergirded the expansion of U.S. imperialism. It has financed it. It has enabled the destruction of our peoples and our nations around the world. And it is the BDS campaign, which is, the Palestine is the heart and soul of that campaign. The liberation of Palestine is the heart and soul of that campaign. But what the students recognize, and it's their brilliance that I think is really angering the universities. What the students recognize is that in order to defeat U.S. imperialism, you have to deal with these weapons manufacturers. They are central to U.S. imperialism. And this is not entirely a new phenomenon. The rate of return is a new phenomenon, right? Because of the expansion of the imperial economy, the American imperial economy. But this is something that actually FDR is the person that launched the war economy. And it was loved. It's still loved. People still talk about how great FDR was. But he really was critical to creating the modern era of U.S. imperialism. The war economy, dollar dominance, all the global institutions that basically run the world now and are failing the global majority, all this stuff emerged during the FDR period, the long FDR period. And it was so severe back then that when Eisenhower came, again, no, radical, right? When Eisenhower came into office, he critiqued the rise of the military-industrial complex. And that is basically the era that we are now, sort of the economic era that we're now living in. And all we have to do is watch. We're watching it live in terms of its consequences in Palestine, right? People being burned alive. We're watching human beings attached to IVs burned alive. We've seen dangling body parts of children. We're actually watching this, and it's not stopping. This is why.
Yeah, sorry, I just kind of lost my train of thought here because I just reimagining those images in my mind is a little bit. I think there was also an image of a journalist who was actually at his computer, his laptop, and he was burned alive. And these images have not moved the policymakers away from funding this genocide and backing this genocide and leading this genocide. And we can even look at the Biden, this came out through Drop Site News, where this wasn't news to a lot of us, but they were saying, Biden, his administration didn't even push the question of a ceasefire when dealing with their Zionist counterparts who were waging this war. I would argue that they were probably not, it wasn't about a matter of holding them back. It was a matter of helping direct these attacks and direct and finance this. I think there's this idea that somehow Joe Biden sort of sleepwalk. I mean, he's basically sleepwalking as an individual, but this idea that he was sleepwalking into this war. And if you look at the New York Times reportage, if you look at mainstream outlets, they always use this word sleepwalking into war, and it's as if the United States is just, oh, we didn't really mean to go to war here, we didn't really mean to invade this country, we didn't really mean to have this massive military footprint around the globe where we have over 900 overseas military bases. It eliminates intent. And as you're showing with looking at these numbers in the defense industry and the rates of return on their investments, this is a profitable enterprise. It's the state and finance capital working hand in hand. That's even before Trump. Trump didn't do anything new in that context. And I would also argue that when we talk about imperialism overseas, or excuse me, when you talk about U.S. imperialism and what makes U.S. imperialism an imperialist nation state, one is the dominance of the U.S. dollar, which we still maintain. One would be we used to have. I say we. I'm using that as not something that I'm like upholding, but there used to be domestic manufacture, right, and a strong industrial base. That's no longer. That's all been shipped overseas. And the third one is um, the sort of kinetic power of the United States as its military power, right? And we're sort of seeing the decline of the U.S., the dominance of the U.S. dollar, and I would say like Trump and this whole fiasco around his tariffs and this idea, like he even lied about saying that like Xi Jinping just recently called him about negotiating. It's like China is actually just they've been preparing for this moment. They've been preparing for this moment to de-link from the United States. China doesn't need the US, right? The US needs China because it's got itself into this situation in terms of shipping out its manufacturing, and also it's about depressing wages, all these other things. But there's no way, you can't unbake the cake, you can't unscramble the egg, so to speak. You can't bring this back, this idea that somehow there's going to be this magnificent return of US manufacturing is completely absurd, because the United States, even the things that it does manufacture, like electric vehicles, are crap compared to what's coming out of China. I mean, let's just be honest. The technology sector, it's lagging behind. All signs are showing that we're looking at a decline. And I want to move into this. What does fascism do in a declining empire? And I want to read this quote that you have in this article, and maybe have you reflect on it a little bit more. You've touched on a little bit on it, but it says domination. You're right. Domination is not the defining feature of fascism, especially since it arrives to power through popular consent. Rather, it is defined by the fall of imperialism, the seizure of the state by the most reactionary elements of finance capital, which you've kind of touched on, and the collapse of state institutions under the aegis of the executive branch. In effect, fascism emerges to enforce the empire's last remaining frontiers of capital accumulation.
So I should say that the last remaining frontiers of capital accumulation, I borrow from Jeanette Graulau, who's a political economist at CUNY and a mutual friend and comrade of Nick and I's. This is where, again, this change over time question is really important, because it is widely accepted, by virtually everybody, including the US military, that we are squarely in the final stages of US imperialism. And if you historically, like if you look at the German and Italian, the rise of fascism in those contexts, and I'm not particularly interested in the liberal debate about which one is, but what's the difference between the two, which one's fascism, Spanish, all that stuff. It was the end of their colonial empires. They were facing the end of their colonial empires. And we're sort of in the same predicament here, not today. What China has said in response to the US is that the figure was like 2.5%, that their own nation represents the majority of the profits from their consumption. So it's true, you are entirely correct, that China does not need the US. And in fact, China holds the majority of US debt. So this is sort of the economic picture, right? But then you also have the military picture, which is, this is what military magazines and blogs are saying, that American weapons are so bespoke that they're very slow to manufacture. It's difficult to manufacture them. The wars in Ukraine and Palestine, the supply of Israel, has drained the arms stockpile so much that, again, military magazines and whatnot are saying, should the US go to war with China, which I don't think it can, it certainly can't right now, a military war, a sort of a direct military war, it won't be able to keep up. So you have an economic picture where the US is struggling. We can see it, in our lives, in our universities, in the state of infrastructure, in the state of healthcare, in addition to this economic question, this finance question. You have a military picture where the US can't compete anymore. So we are truly looking at, in light of this, an inability on the part of the state to steal resources from other nations around the world in the way that it once did, especially in the Eastern Hemisphere, in Asia and Africa. So when Trump came in and said, I want Greenland and Canada, it sounded like a joke. It truly sounded like a joke, but it wasn't. It was not a joke. They need the minerals and the resources from those places to replace what they once got from the Eastern Hemisphere. And this is what Jeanette calls the last frontiers of capital accumulation. You also have to exploit your own populations in a way that you didn't before. And so Horn and Ballas say that we're on the verge, or I can't remember what term they use. It's not precipice, but it's a synonym for precipice. What they say is that we're basically on the precipice of fascism, and I wholeheartedly agree with them. I think that once exploitation, we're going to see new levels of labor and racial exploitation and colonial exploitation in this hemisphere that we haven't seen before. And then combined with some legal questions, especially surrounding Trump's potential next term, right, 2028, then we might really sort of be walking into, at that point, we might be walking into sort of de jure or more traditional fascism.
Yeah, it's quite, it's interesting because it's also even the sort of the way, and I appreciate the way that Horn and Ballas really sort of dispel this hyper focus on Trump the person, right? And there's a lot of focus on that in the media, right? What is he saying? How does he say it? His obsession with gold, like he's putting gold all over the Oval Office, and he's doing, all this sort of extravagant things. He's, and there are elements of that are pretty concerning, like the putting up of yard signs of people that he views as criminal. That's a bad sign, like in any sort of society, when you start doing that level of a criminalization of whole swaths of people, right? And the celebration of that sort of brutality and extreme violence. But like the signal leaks that happen with so-called signal leaks, who knows, what Jeffrey Goldberg is a raging Zionist. At one of the he was an IDF soldier, an IDF guard at one of the a prison camp, right? That was known for engaging in torture, and he becomes the sort of the chief editor at the Atlantic, and he supposedly was accidentally, who knows, put in on the signal chat, and his whole thing was, this is a breach of security and blah 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 blah. No, there was no real conversation around how they were just openly committing war crimes and celebrating it, and the targeting of an apartment building That was like, there was no clear indication that this was a military target. It was just like, oh yeah, it's this guy's, girlfriend's house, and it's an apartment building. There was no concern around that, right? And there's still no concern around not only the current bombing campaign in Yemen to dislodge and disrupt and to diminish the military potential of um, Ansar Allah. There's no context around the U.S. backed, genocide against Yemenis by the Saudis for the last like decade, and 500,000 people died in this awful. It was like one of the worst, um, you know, uh, starvation campaigns in recent memory. There's no context around this, right? And to me, it's, and Yemen is supposed to have this diminished military capacity because the United States is so great, and they've done 800 or how many hundreds of air campaigns against, bombing campaigns against Ansar Allah, who they call the Houthis, and it's supposed to have diminished their military capacity. Yet we're seeing the actual sort of consequences of this, Ansar Allah's really brave and heroic resistance against U.S. military presence in the Red Sea, the violation of their national sovereignty, but also a strident demand that they will back down once the United States and its kind of its Zionist partners stop its genocide in Gaza. And and it's showing that this country, even surviving, coming out of this brutal war, Saudi-led war against them, that they're still holding back U.S. projection of power in the region, to the point that the United States has deployed, or these U.S. aircrafts have deployed so many anti-air defense systems. It's just draining the sort of pocket of the U.S. military in ways that it demonstrates the sort of weakness of the U.S. military and its sort of stretch and its overstretch around the globe, and the costliness that it has, that this country and these people in this nation, who are supposed to have been starved into submission, can hold back one of the most powerful military forces on the planet and in world history, or as we're told. But this is something that's been going on since Vietnam, right? The U.S. hasn't really won a war. It lost in Iraq, it lost in Afghanistan, it lost the U.S. war, the so-called U.S. war on terror. It's just something that it evokes to create new enemies. So we're seeing, this decline in that context, and as you pointed out, just now, that the major components, the materials for this weapons industry are coming from China, these rare earth minerals, right? These rare earth materials. And this was something that we were talking about, I think, back in 2016, when, there was this kind of big push to develop lithium mining in the Andean region, going after people like Evo Morales and people who were trying to nationalize their reserves because you had this new sort of green transition that was coming up. And now we see like China basically cutting off the United States from these materials, and all these, I can't name all the minerals, but they're basically materials that are used in weapon components, right, to develop these weapons, these missiles. But at the same time, it's like we've talked about. You mentioned this at the beginning of the interview about this rise of the billionaire class and the alliance of finance capital with the state. There's everyone's looking at like Elon Musk as sort of this clownish figure that's like in the Oval Office, but a lot of people like he's going back to Tesla, right? And he's going to focus more on Tesla, and everyone's like Tesla makes crap cars, but also Elon Musk has a lot of defense contracts to make rockets. He's also building plants in Nevada in the Great Basin, because he recognized, I mean, he's not an idiot. He recognized that there's going to be a transition that's going to take place, and that he needs to be in Nevada. He needs to have plants and a foothold in Nevada so that he can start developing lithium deposits there, and potentially what other rare earth minerals that may exist in that area. This is the same thing that happened under Obama with fracking, to develop the national sort of domestic oil production to offset imports from Venezuela, but also to crush the Iranian oil industry, right, through sanctions, but also through lowering the price of oil through the development of cheap and exploitative natural, or excuse me, fracked fracked oil. This was, so that there's all these sort of factors at play. And I want to bring it back to the question of the law, because you're a legal historian, right? And this article is all about the law and like how the court treats civil rights speech, how it treats free speech, and a lot of the things that we were talking about when it comes up in the mainstream media, it's like a question of Palestine. As you pointed out, it's like, no, BDS has targeted the defense industry for a specific reason. It's not just an abstract concept that like this is kind of the biggest obstacle. It's understanding that this is the sort of the linchpin of U.S. empire, but it's also its soft underbelly in terms of as we've seen with the overstretch of the U.S. military. But how do we, as people who are academics, as people who are activists on the ground, sort of understand the shifts that are happening within the legal system right now? What is the best way to combat it? How should we be organizing not just defensive actions, but potentially offensive actions?
I'm going to talk about the law, but before I do that, I actually want to just mention a quote. So Biden, he in December, right before he left office, it was in the fall, late fall, he did a speech at some sort of military event, and I quote it. I think I cite the quote in the paper, where he thanks the military, and he says to them, you have never done so much in so many places throughout the world. And this is a recognition, right, of what you just said, which is that the US military is doing a lot, but it's also stretched very, very thin. And part of the fall of US imperialism is this like planetary control that took effect after the fall of the Soviet Union. It's now spread so thin, in Biden's own terms, that it can't hold it anymore. And once you have a nation of people like Yemen, you have the Iranians, the Chinese, etc., fighting back. The Russians are fighting back. The Alliance of Sahel States fighting back. It's only a matter of time before the chips really fall, and fall in a decisive way. So I just wanted to highlight that Biden quote because it's really interesting. So the law. Amiya Kumar Bakshi, who's a brilliant political economist and I think sociologist, I'm not sure, or anthropologist, who recently passed away, unfortunately. I don't have the book here, but he defines fascism sort of aligned with more traditionalist definition of fascism, which is the collapse of the various branches of government under the aegis of the executive. And he says, he says that fascism usually emerges in states that are bourgeois democratic, because you need the bourgeois democracy to facilitate the rise of the fascists, and in states that have historically had separation of powers, like the United States. The fact of the matter is that when you look at the law, so when you take a legal historical view of state power in the United States, that it's not surprising. Like what's happening now is not surprising, because labor law has been central to like basically defeating worker power, right? And again, like the U.S. labor is no bastion of radicalism, but they sort of fight for the worker a little bit. But that labor law has basically decimated the power of the worker vis-a-vis the capitalist, the owner. I'm a civil procedure professor, and so I spend a lot of time on this question of jurisdiction, right? Jurisdiction is limited. Access to courts, access to justice has been limited over time. If you look at dissent and the free speech law, the First Amendment, um, when the communists were engaged in speech activity, the courts were very quick to suppress it, right? Then once the communists basically lost, right, they were defeated through McCarthyism and a variety of different factors. The left basically lost. All of a sudden, speech law expanded. And then sort of alongside that, toward the end of that, and then really through the current moment, you had the rise of Klan speech, or what I call the Klan canon of the First Amendment. And that, courts are very quick to say this is vile speech, this is speech that we don't like, et cetera, but we have to accept it because there's a marketplace of ideas, quote unquote. And in a marketplace of ideas, the only thing that can and should defeat bad speech or vile speech is good speech, right? And so we put the vile speech out there and then good speech defeats it. That did not apply to the communists. They weren't even willing to call the communists bad speech, right? I think that should, in and of itself, that's interesting. And so now we're in this environment where sort of Klan type elements, Nazi type elements can say whatever they want under the guise of freedom of speech. And this has been happening for like decades in terms of the law. It's been happening for decades. So why would we be surprised that now the president of the United States says the things that he says so openly? Beyond what he does, right? He actually also says it quite clearly. So there's the free speech question, there's labor law, and then there's also jurisdiction and sort of the power of corporations in the law, which has increased dramatically over the last couple of decades. And then you have executive power. And every president, especially in the modern era, loves executive power. They're critical of it until they become president. This is what Justice Elena Kagan actually says. They're critical of it until they become into power. And then they're like, maybe it's not so bad. And they expand it. So it's no surprise that we're at this moment. Now, what's interesting about this moment is that, and I want to take us back to what Bakshi says about the collapse of the three branches under the aegis, or the collapse of the branches under the aegis of the executive. So Congress has basically been neutralized, right? Whether it's for whatever reason. I mean, we can talk. I don't want to talk about it. Money, the lobbies, whatever, right? Like Congress has been neutralized. They don't pass any major legislation that is of any kind really anymore, unless it supports state power and finance capital and the capitalist class. So what's left is the judicial branch, and this aggression against the judicial branch right now. At least, when I just came back from a conference at the Association of American Law Schools, and, so in the legal community, this is really what we're spending a lot of time talking about, whether the judicial branch will actually capitulate to the executive. If the judicial branch starts making decisions, making decisions based on what the executive branch wants, it will have capitulated. If the executive branch says, we're not going to listen to you, which it is doing that more or less right now by refusing to bring back Kilmar Abrego Garcia, arresting the judge in, I think, Wisconsin. If it continues to do that stuff, then the judicial branch will not necessarily have capitulated, but it will be its power will be narrowed. Or what's more likely is that it'll be a combination of both, right, over the course of the next 4 years, 3.5 years now. The question of Trump's third term is a serious question because he's not allowed to have a third term under the Constitution. if somehow he gets a third term, then all of a sudden, the rule of law and what we've known of the rule of law, what we've thought of the rule of law, will have been entirely transformed. So, it's no surprise that we're at this moment, but the process is not complete. And the completion of the process appears to be in the making. We don't know, right? We don't know what's going to happen to state power in the United States. But if you look at historically the fall of imperialism, capitalist imperialism in other contexts, they have to line their pockets somehow when their empires fall. They have to repress us and our people somehow when empires fall. And what's really interesting about the US context is that it's very unstable. Americans like to think that we live in this super stable place, this the American exceptionalism, super stable rule of law, sea to shining sea, contiguous borders, all that. But the reality is that there are ongoing disputes with indigenous nations. Indigenous nations have not given up their treaty rights. There are ongoing disputes in the island holdings like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, etc., Guam, the Virgin Islands. There's a serious problem with federalism, right? Which is the state power versus the federal government. This has created the conditions to maintain empire through such a vast land that's so geographically different, right? Geographically and culturally different from, across the whole land. But now, states are increasingly angry with the federal government. That's been going on for a little while. And so there's really not a lot of stability. We're not even talking about the Eastern Hemisphere anymore. Now we're talking about here. And then you have Black people who are calling for reparations, right? Reparations is no longer a radical call, a radical left call. It is now squarely a liberal question. You have Black people calling for land rights. So the stability that we think we have here, I think it's time to call it into question. At least if we're going to be serious thinkers and scholars and activists. I can't. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Oh yeah, no. I'm gonna restate the question, but because I do want to get back to what do we do in this moment, especially when it comes to. But I have a quick comment because there was an article that came out by my friend and former guest on the show, Rebecca Nagel, Cherokee journalist, who talked about the Marshall Trilogy, and the executive frequently, not enforcing the orders of the court, of the Supreme Court, and actually, flagrantly violating those orders, especially when it comes to indigenous nations. This happened in Cherokee removal. John Marshall, the Chief Justice, in the early 1800s, basically said or ruled that that this is an unconstitutional sort of violation of, and that the executive can't go forward with this removal. And Andrew Jackson basically said, well, that's the court orders, let them enforce it, and just went ahead and with removal anyways. And it's no coincidence that Trump's favorite president, one of his favorite presidents, is Andrew Jackson. I don't know if that's a direct sort of signal to his sort of authoritarian populism, whatever you want to call it. But it's also the fact that he was, a violent Indian killer. If anyone, has the opportunity, you should just look at what Jackson's campaign against the Seminoles looked like. It was very extreme. It was very violent. And then he was also, a slaver. He was somebody who believed in the institution of slavery. So this isn't, we're not, the things that Trump is doing is not unprecedented in US history. And I want to maybe like hone in a little bit more about what then makes this a unique moment, because you can't ignore uh the mandate that he has in terms of like winning the popular vote, and the tens of millions of people that make up his base. And we can sit and look at this so just put the golden age of the oligarchy is upon us, and showing like who is Trump's base. Yes, it is this 5 million voters, but it's also the ruling class, the billionaire ruling class, on the other hand. But I also just want to kind of like ask a little bit more, like, what is it that makes this moment particularly dangerous in terms of what can play out? Because I think there's these polls that are coming out, saying that Trump's popularity has sunk lower than his previous, or his disapproval ratings have sunk lower than his previous presidency. But what they're also not saying is that Democrats are more unpopular than they've ever been. And so like that is like fascinating, because that could be on one hand an extremely dangerous thing if you're a liberal, or a scary thing if you're a liberal. But on the other hand, if you're somebody who believes in social justice, like this could be a unique opportunity to build something like a third party, or a movement, that really captures the anger and the frustration of this moment. And this, to rephrase the question that I asked before, like, where do lawyers, where do legal scholars of your kind, fit into this moment in terms of how do we advance an agenda, that isn't just sort of doing a defensive and protecting these sort of constitutional norms, and protecting the rule of law and all these things, but is advancing social justice causes, and advancing things that open spaces for, not just stopping Trump, but open spaces for a different kind of social, political, economic
So
order.
this is actually like the heart of the conversation that we had over the weekend at the conference. So part of what Horn and Ballas really hone in on in their analysis is the role of class collaborationism in the rise of fascism. And actually in this particular moment, they talk specifically about class collaborationism right now, right? The white working class and the white middle class sort of aligning with the billionaire class. The reality is that fascism is a populist impulse because it's an answer to it presents itself as the answer to the problems of capitalist life for the working and middle classes, especially white working and middle classes. Or working, yeah. Any response that has effectively defeated fascism, and we're not talking right about like the tactics, right, striking and etc., has to include, or any effective response has to include socialism. It has to include a redistribution of wealth and resources. And like I tell you, and I was shocked, Nick, like I was at a law professor's conference where people were basically saying the same thing. It was not like one need not be a Marxist Leninist to say enough is enough. So this has to be central to any kind of new order. The thing about the United States is that it's a settler colony and it's a continental empire. And so I personally do not want the current arrangement that we have, but socialist, right? I think the indigenous nations need to get their land back, however they define that. I think Black people need to get reparations, in concert or in coalition with Indigenous nations, whatever that looks like to these communities and these peoples. And then I think this question of what like socialism or like life looks like for the settlers, that's secondary actually to those other questions. Because if the continental empire is addressed, the rest of the world will be free as well from US imperialism, in addition to the people here. So for me, when I think about what to do, and like I think those questions are paramount. Um, uh, and that's precisely why the moment, as you started, right, is especially dangerous. Because I think, maybe liberals don't get it. The Democrats certainly don't. I don't know what's going on. But there are people in positions of power that get it.
Oh, I know what's going on with the Democrats.
So
I know what's going on with the Democrats. But no, I think you're right. And I think what I've noticed, even with my own, I do a lot of public engagement with people, and sometimes you'll get these like liberals, mostly like well-meaning sort of white liberals, who are proposing things and like saying, well, it's really complicated. And it's like, it's not really complicated if you're on the receiving end of genocide. Like, you want to nuance a genocide, and you want to also, it's this elitist kind of response to say that, like, even against like white people, that they cannot comprehend a world of equality, or what that might look like. Like, it's actually like they're the ones who are like selling you a bag of, rotten apples. It's not me. Like, I'm the one that's like attempting to actually narrate a true history of the US. The United States is an empire, and it is also selling out, and it's, I think, what um I like Gerald Horne's kind of definition of settler colonialism as class collaboration. And like, that's what it really comes down to, is it's a white class collaboration, a white settler class collaboration. Settler doesn't also include, and this term is like, we're going to stay tuned, folks. We're going to get into that term in a podcast in the future. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about that, because it's a very important term. It's not something that like I'm just throwing around because it's like an identity politics thing. It's actually a legal term that's in the law that actually defines non-native rights against native rights. Again, when it's, you are party to treaties. If you live in the United States and you're a citizen of this country, you are a party to native treaties. Your obligation is to uphold those treaties. Are you doing that? It's not an Indian problem. We've always had a settler problem, and that's an issue that we have to address. I don't know how that's going to work itself out in the law, but I do think that you need, like, I think what you're pointing to in, at the end of this article in this draft, is this need for an alignment of legal scholars and lawyers with social movements, right? I think this idea that somehow, if we just tweak this wording here and this law here, and all these judges who sit on these benches, they kind of sit above society, and it's like, that's not even even if you're not a socialist, it's not even a correct reading of reality. Like, there are special interest groups that are at play. Capital is a social political force, right? So are people. So are people who are in the streets, people whose lives, are affected by these things, and who have, hopes and dreams and aspirations, who have children, who, all these things. Like, there are people who make up these institutions that aren't just sitting in Washington, D.C. And we have such an upside down view of what democracy is, that we've been convinced that politicians, that we respond to politicians, not the other way around, right? And I think what we're seeing, even in my my classes that I teach and the interactions I have with students, there's this fundamental understanding that the system just does not work for them. It's not designed for them. It's completely disenfranchised them and alienated them. They're not on board with the Democratic Party. They're not on board with the Republican Party. this is not a moment of despair. This is actually, I think I've been saying this for a while. It's like a moment of opportunity. Like
Yes,
movements are
exactly.
defined,
Yeah.
movements are defined. Like I can't remember what it was. It was, trees themselves, their wood gets hard in periods of drought, not in periods of abundance of rain, right? And I think the same could be defined with social movements, is that these moments that are seen as like defeats, it's like, well, who's calling? Yeah, it is a defeat, in the sense that this guy got into power and these things are happening, bad things are happening, but it's also a movement, where we kind of forge ourselves and our power, to fight back, and it's a moment to be brave, right? And I think that's the sort of the secret sauce in this moment in time, is to be very bold in how we're pushing back against things. And we are seeing it in some quarters. We are seeing this pushback happen, and we're waiting for that other shoe to drop, because I think it eventually will, where Trump is going to have to respond and start repressing the so-called domestic elements, in a way that we probably haven't seen in generations. If you're a colonized person, you've probably experienced this, right? But if you are somebody who is fighting for justice, right, in this moment, and you ally yourself with these movements, you're going to start seeing this kind of that other shoe to drop. And I think it's a moment also for allies within the legal profession to really step up, and we are seeing that. I'm not saying it's not happening, but anyways, I'm kind of just like rambling, because I feel like the I've been sort of reluctant to weigh in on the question of fascism, mostly because I don't feel like people have a full understanding of settler colonialism or take it seriously. And when we understand that, it's like, even if Trump didn't win, we would still be under the rule of settler sort of regime, right? I think that's important to understand, because we have to transcend that in some way. We can't be just saying that, like, well, the worst, if we don't vote for this, we just want a milder form of colonialism. That's not real options to people. That's not a real option for Palestine. That's not a real option for all the, the colonized, nations that make up what is the United States. That's not a real option. That's not a true kind of path towards freedom and liberation. But anyways, I'm sort of rambling, but I want to get back to just like in this moment, if you could just maybe identify some sort of key areas. We've been talking about them, but sort of key areas where you see kind of hope and possibility, especially in the realms of the law, as a way to kind of push back on these things, or to kind of change the tide, so to speak, in this current moment.
I'm, sort of used to being really critical of the law. That's kind of what I normally do. Um, but, you're right, that it's important also to think about how to use all the tools that are at our disposal. Um, and frankly, I think the call for land back and reparations, and for lawyers to support those calls, reparations at an international level, right? So like Nicaragua should get all the money that it won in the ICJ suit in the 80s. I mean, uh, which is like in the billions. I mean, I think it's more than the GDP of all of Nicaragua right now. Uh, all the money and wealth that's been seized through sanctions needs to be returned to all the nations around the world, mostly formerly colonized nations. Um, uh, the treaties need to be recognized. Land back needs to be taken seriously. Actual land back, where people like leave their homes if they have to, right? Like, to honor those treaties. And then also, and so this is like, if we think of sort of the US as a bunch of internal colonies, right, which is the way the Black radicals thought of it, we have to think critically about, if we want to end settler colonialism or end imperialism, how do we get these places to no longer be internal colonies but be liberated, right? Um, and then I was going to say one last.
And just to be clear, there are models of where this exists. Like if we look in Venezuela,
Living
a commune
models.
model.
Yes.
Yeah, there's like actual existing models where this exists. Anyway, sorry, I just wanted
No,
to point that
no,
out,
I
because it's
appreciate
not
that.
just this, like, it's not just coming from the brains of academics. It's
No.
like like people are living these models of redistribution, of community power, of real food sovereignty.
Yes.
And it's, it's not without struggle. Like they're doing this under sanctions. They're doing this under the threat of
Massive wealth
constant
theft.
invasion and the destruction of their economies.
Yeah, massive looting, massive wealth theft, and they're still able to do it. Also, we need to stop talking about like Ansarallah, right? What they're doing is upholding the Genocide Convention, right? Because they've been very clear that they're going to stop when Israel stops, and they're not even demanding an end to the full and complete genocide. They're just demanding an end to this current iteration of the highly accelerated current iteration of the genocide, right? The Iranians, when they support the Palestinians, they are supporting an anti-genocide struggle. They're upholding the Geneva Conventions. And so we have to, there are ways in which the liberal legal order, with all its problems, right? The problems are many. The problems are many. But there are ways in which even the liberal legal order is upholding the activities of anti-imperialist or supports anti-imperialist positions and anti-colonial positions. So, we need to stop talking about Ansarallah, the Houthis, as terrorists. They now have state power in Yemen. They are the Yemeni government. And so this stuff also, I think, is really important. And I was talking to a mutual friend of ours yesterday where I said, Eurocentric modes of thinking have always been a huge problem and annoying and incorrect. But now, especially, Eurocentric modes of thinking cannot adequately explain what is happening in the world today. They cannot there is no mode of thinking in the West to adequately explain what Yemen is doing. And for American scholars or European scholars, and even a lot of our colleagues that are not white, but work in this context, to not see this stuff and to repeat the lies, to not open a book or open a website and actually read about what's happening. It's really disturbing. So there's obviously the role of the lawyer, which I talked about, but there's also the specific role of the lawyer and the legal academic. But then there's this role of us to actually think critically about what's happening around the world. And there's ways in which the lawyer and the legal academic can help us do that.
I think of even how we frame threats, and I listen to bourgeois media all the time. I torture myself and my family with it.
Nationalist Pentagon Radio. I listen to that almost every morning.
Actually, yes, I do. That's very true. And New York Times and all the all that jazz. But one thing they always say is China, our number one adversary. And I'm I just it always blows my mind. And imagine, you don't know anything about this country, which is full of 1 billion people, and it's a massive country. It's very diverse. It's not just everyone's Han Chinese. It's very diverse. There's dozens and dozens of ethnicities and minorities within the country itself. But yet, what has China actually done to the United States? I don't, or what has it done to the person who's working at, who's bagging your groceries at Walmart? I don't really know. I mean, I always look at the statistic in the Twin Cities where where I live, and it's 1,600 people died of air pollution in 2015. That's 10% of all deaths in these cities. China didn't do that. That was American capitalism. That was American settler colonialism. That is not this framing of enemies, the way that, not just Trump, but the kind of ruling elite dictate to us who is the real threat. Really, just I've come to this moment of with this genocide. It's how do you get beyond this sort of the propaganda arm of American empire? How do you break through, to people? And it's, I think it's just really just like laying out the facts of like who actually kills, people, who's taking away your homes, who's taking away your jobs. It's shocking to me that labor unions in this moment are framing workers throughout the world who are literally doing the same jobs as their union members as threats. Like that is the definition of reactionary sort of divisive imperialist behavior. Why is it this a worker, you talk about worker solidarity, why is it a worker in a different country with a different color skin, speaks a different language, doing the exact same job as your worker, somehow a threat to the worker in the United States? And you talked about labor unions, and I'm not convinced in this moment that these big unions, these auto unions, how they're like supporting Trump's tariffs. You have Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters who's lining up with Trump and espousing the most reactionary kind of forms of US nationalism and white supremacy as sort of hopes that we're supposed to look towards. It's not to say that we shouldn't join unions. We should join unions, but we can't, like, the union itself is also a captured institution. It doesn't mean that we just disband them. That's not what I'm saying. It means that those struggles have to happen at all levels, to actually say that the person who's doing the exact same job as you is not your enemy. And in fact, the person who's telling you that they're your enemy is your enemy. And let's be clear about the stakes of that. And that goes with, just beyond doing jobs, it goes into political projects. Like, why is it that China is being framed as the United States' number one adversary in what? Like, it's like, what are they adversely affecting, the everyday person in the United States? How are they adversely affecting? They're making your cell phones, they're making your, like, everything that you order on Amazon. Anyways, I'm kind of like going off topic here, but I think when you talked about this global sort of liberal legal order that a lot of people appeal to, like such as the United Nations, in some ways I feel though that the United Nations and human rights frameworks have been completely bankrupted in this moment, in their failure, as you just pointed out, to even to reframe what Ansar Allah is doing is upholding the Genocide Convention, right? In the Genocide Convention, everyone is like, thinks of it as defining the crime of genocide. It's actually about the prevention and the punishment of the crime of genocide. So where do you think, I mean, to just kind of elaborate a little bit more, like, and to scale up your article a little bit more to the international sort of like context of the ICJ, these international legal orders and courts. What role does international law play, like, in this moment now? Has the United Nations just been completely delegitimized and we have to move beyond, or what are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to sort of answer it very honestly, out of respect for you. So I myself am not a huge supporter of the international legal apparatus and the institutions that uphold it. And going back to sort of FDR, like a lot of these institutions, this stuff all sort of blossomed in the FDR era and the immediate period after FDR, right? I mean, he was very central to the creation of all this stuff, his administration. And it's designed really to uphold U.S. power, especially in the Western Hemisphere, and then around the world as well. That said, a lot of the nations that have managed to retain some independence from the clutches of U.S. empire, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, etc., actually look to international. They try to use international law and international institutions to their advantage. So Venezuela and some friends created the Friends of the UN Charter, I think, which is it's a block of sort of more critical. I'm not going to call them non-aligned, right? But like more critical nations that are critical of U.S. imperialism, broadly, very broadly defined. Um, uh, the Palestinians and the South Africans are using the ICJ, right? The ICC, which is basically like a court to like, excuse me, that goes after Africans almost exclusively. People are trying to use them. And so on the one hand, it's easy for me as a scholar to read Anthony Angie and like all these sort of people that are very critical of international law and then and believe it, right? And agree with it and believe it. On the other hand, I'm so sorry, excuse me. There's the practice, right? There's the living practice of creating the world in which we want to live. And we use, those of us that are activists know that we use a diversity of tactics. And one of the tools at our disposal is using the language of international law or the spaces that international law creates to expose US imperialism for what it is and to legitimize anti-imperialist and anti-colonial struggles. So I think there's a space to do that. Nations around the world that I respect that are trying to do good work are doing that. And so for me, I try to hold both. I try to hold the critique while also holding the promise, right? In a new world, if, should we be so lucky to be alive when the new world order is created? Excuse me. I don't know whether or not the UN is going to exist. The Nicaraguans have a vision of they have a vision for reforming the UN. I don't know if that's plausible. But I will follow the lead of people who are truly doing the work of socialism, in a way that I am not, right? As a scholar.
I think though too, it's important to remember that some of those kind of key frameworks, those key conventions came out of the socialist bloc, non-aligned movement. Like even the Declaration on the Granting of Independence of Colonial People. This was fought for by a lot of like socialist and anti-colonial movements. And I think that there's like we can't I don't want to throw everything out in the United Nations. We can say that's ineffective, right? But it's also the question of enforcement, right? It's kind of this question of like, in the US, it's like, okay, so we know that this is against the law. We know that, there are arrest warrants for the leaders, of the Zionist, the Zionist-led genocide in Palestine right now. It's whether or not the world is going to enforce, those warrants. And we've seen that they're people who are openly accomplices to these fugitives of the law, right? That doesn't mean that we just kind of like I really hesitate to like withdraw, even though the prosecutor we might have questions about and his motives and on this or that, or why he waited for so long on this, or why he went after these people. But nonetheless, it's an expression of overwhelming majority of the world who sees this as a crime and a criminal act. And we can say that it's not just something that can be isolated to a specific region, because I think in many ways, much like, Trump is using extreme violence and brutality against migrants and, the detention of protesters who are in solidarity with Palestine as an example to project his power. I would say that the genocide in Gaza is actually the brutality of it is a message to the world. This is what's going to happen to you, if you decide to, try to throw off the yoke of imperialism, if you try to get rid of a military base, or you try to step away from the sort of hegemony of the United States. Like these are the consequences. And so in many ways, like it's not just about like Palestinian liberation isn't just about the liberation of Palestine. It's about showing that even the most humble people on the planet right now can hold back the forces of reaction can hold back the forces of imperialism, not without cost, definitely not without cost and sacrifice. But the question then becomes, as I think you're kind of alluding to, is like, then what do we do? What is our investment? And I always just remember my friends in Venezuela who literally, in the kind of depths of the intensified blockade and sanctions against Venezuela, and I'm sure this is the same in Cuba, which I haven't been to, that they literally lost pounds off their body because they believed in the project, their socialist project of liberation. And I always wonder, they went without meals. They had family members who couldn't get access to medication, who died unnecessarily. These sanctions killed people. They didn't kill the people who were elected into positions of power. They killed everyday people, the most vulnerable. They killed native people. They killed indigenous people. They targeted indigenous communities. And it's something that's not talked about. And I always just wonder, what is it? What do we have that same sort of fortitude? And I think it's not just a question of like, are we going to stand in the face, of this reaction right now, and what are we going to do? It's not about adventurism. It's not about just like willy-nilly sacrificing ourselves, because we don't really have a project in terms of like a direction that we're moving right now. And I think that's that's where we need to go. This is me just opinionating, but I think that's where we need to go, and we see it coalescing. We see the numbers. We have the numbers. Like, we've had historic marches for Palestine, more so than other issues that impact people. And I think that's to me, again, I just I'm trying to be optimistic. It means that the tide of history is changing in a way, not just globally, but also domestically in this country. And we're seeing this sort of the edifice of this reaction, even Trump's alleged successes, sort of cracking, right? So it doesn't make him less dangerous, doesn't make the current moment less dangerous and precarious, but it shows that there is another world that is possible in this moment. It's just it's going to be a long struggle. It's not going to happen in the next election cycle, right? And we have to be on a different timeline than these bourgeois elections. Let's just be honest about that. And we have, as scholars, we have to be on a different timeline in terms of how we study history and how we study social movements. We can't really fall into the trap of just being responding to the moment. It's important to respond to the moment. It's important to read the conditions, but it's also important to understand what are legitimate threats, and what are moments of possibility. And I'll just give it over to you, Nina, for the sort of last word. I really appreciate you joining us in the morning. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard for people who come on the show to talk in the morning. I'm a morning person, but I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your cogent analysis in this article. I'm looking forward to its publication. I really appreciate your work and your book. And when your book comes out, we're definitely going to have you on the podcast to talk about it. And maybe you could talk a little bit about what your book is, so that people can know what to expect.
Sure. So the book actually it's about imperialism and resistance. It's called Imperial. I think I don't know. The title keeps changing, but I think it's going to be called Imperialism and Resistance. And I look at a series of case studies of sort of how of U.S. imperialism and then the and resistance against it. But I don't just look at the iteration of resistance that is here, right? That is local. So I look at the Korean War, what the U.S. did in Korea, and then Black communist resistance to it here with a focus on Claudia Jones. I also talk about Angelo Herndon in the beginning of the book, and the role that he played in building a working class resistance to the capitalist state. I then actually look at the American Indian movement and the prosecution of AIM leaders and then Leonard Peltier. And following your work, I treat AIM as a national liberation struggle in the United States. And I look specifically at the targeting of Leonard Peltier and the legal questions around his case. Then I go actually to the Nicaraguan Revolution and the Contra War to destroy the revolution, the unsuccessful Contra War to destroy the revolution, and the support of the Nicaraguans here, right? And how the Nicaraguans used the law to support their struggle. And then I end with Palestine. The chapter 7 is on the Los Angeles 8 case, which is a case involving 7 Palestinians and 1 Kenyan. It's the target. The FBI called it the first terrorism prosecution. They won, but it was the longest immigration case in U.S. history. And then the very last chapter is on Al-Aqsa flood and what has happened over the last, year and a half. And I try to sort of complicate or trouble this idea that the U.S. is a discrete nation state. And I look at it as like a series of internal colonies that are in struggle alongside other national liberation movements throughout the world for an equitable socialist world and future. And ultimately, fascism is a counter-revolutionary force, right? And so the book is really sort of looking at the world that is being created right now, and the law's role in undermining it. I also, as last words, I just want to thank you, Nick and Sina, for having me, but also for doing this work and holding the space. Both of you are holding a lot of space and have uplifted anti-imperialist voices in a way that most scholars are unwilling to do. And so I really have a lot of respect for both of you and value both of you a lot. And I want to thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thanks so much. And just one final question: where can people find your work? I'm really looking forward to the book, by the way. Your description of the chapters sound amazing, but
Thank you.
Where can people find your work? And if there's something you want to, uplift in terms of a movement or a cause that we can also put out on our socials.
So this article, article, which I think is going to be called like the legal architecture of fascism. I'm not sure. I'm bad with titles, as you can see. It's coming out. The first iteration, I think it's going to be split into 2 articles, 2 parts. The first part's going to come out in either May or either at the end of this month or in June. The second part will come out in February. And in CUNY Law Review. If you want to look at some of my other work, you can just go to the Albany Law School, my bio page on the Albany Law School website. And in terms of causes and struggles to uphold, I mean, like, obviously your work and the work of Red Nation, the NLG is really important to support right now, the National Lawyers Guild. They're the only bar association in the United States that values human rights over property rights. The International Association of Democratic Lawyers is a great organization as well. Black Alliance for Peace is a really great organization that puts out excellent analysis. Community Movement Builders is another great organization. Obviously, the Palestinian Youth Movement, SJP, right? Like, there's a whole constellation of forces right now that are doing really powerful work toward an equitable, just, socialist future.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Nina.
I'm sure I'm forgetting folks that you can add, maybe, Nick.
I love all those groups. I second those endorsements.